Howdy, all of you delicious people. I am here today to talk about National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. So, recently, when watching this film, I always get the freaking theme song of this movie in my noggin, and it cannot escape. Every single time I watch this movie, I'm like, and here we go on Christmas Vacation. Or whatever the lyrics are, chinga 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 ching ching. Yeah, freaking every time I listen to that song, I'm like, oh my god, this is gonna it's gonna take months to get this song out of my head, and Christmas even isn't even that far along away. Anyways, so within this movie, I think that this film is just honestly just an iconic film when it comes to Christmas. Every year, eventually, this movie gets into your Christmas library or your memory into, yeah, I should probably watch this again because ultimately it's a fun movie. When looking at it, I had completely forgot about this film when ultimately talking about every single Christmas movie that I've had in my noggin and or mind. Because in time, I think when looking at this is kind of off of a franchise of movies. It kind of goes into like Christmas Vacation, Vegas Vacation, and stuff like that, and like Summer Vacation and stuff along those lines. So to me, it always gets lost in the shuffle because it's a franchise of movies, um, a European Vacation and stuff like that, where ultimately it always I always lose train of thought of this movie because when looking at it, it's from a franchise of things, and that's where I always just go, oh, this is just the a very iconic film that everybody goes out of the way to see ultimately during Christmas time. But when looking at it, it's still always a really funny movie. You still always have so many memorable lines. To me, ultimately, like squirrel or this shitter's full, or reasonably any other portions of where you just have people just have to just angrily shout things or whatever, like grace, now blessing is ultimately just the things that kind of pop out of your brain while remembering this film. Uh, Plenty of times where you have people say the wrong things or ultimately are too stupid or too stupid for their own good, probably at some points in this movie. But anyways, so there is a lot of funny parts in a National Lampoon's Vacation movie. When going into this, usually you always have Clark, who always is just in loss for words whenever he meets a hot woman, and then usually fantasizes about that woman, and sometimes that fantasy at some points does come true. But yeah, I always really just thought that this movie or movies, when looking at it as a franchise point of view, every single one of them are you always will go back to them at some point if ultimately you're randomly just kind of flipping around through your streaming of sorts. Ultimately, this movie currently you can see it on AMC Plus right now. So ultimately, if you have AMC Plus, you can probably go out of your way to see this movie. I only probably mention this movie just because of how iconic it is, and it'll probably be either playing somewhere or reasonably people would probably have this movie a lot more in their library or memory of just being, of course, reminded of this movie and wanting to go back to it at some point within this holiday season. So let's ultimately just kind of mention some parts of some of this in a very non-spoiler fashion. Reasonably, we have it to where Clark at a lot of points has seemingly this enemy, which is his own neighbor. Really, it seems that Clark is doing things to either ruin his neighbor's home or otherwise make their neighbors' lives seemingly miserable, which I find hilarious. When also watching this movie, I can't help but also remember a neighbor that would tend to, at some points, just repetitively just keep knocking on any wall or any seemingly place of which that they would be able to knock anywhere in their lives, justifiably. So when looking at a neighbor that is gonna really uh, make your almost holiday in some way miserable or whatever, or have a party or whatever that they go to throw at some point, I can understand that. So we also have to have, of course, have uh, we also have to have, like, of course, like a family reunion of sorts, where it seems that reasonably we have it to where seemingly one part of Clark's family is coming here for Christmas, but then it also seems like Ellen's family is also coming as well. Then it also seems that Clark's cousins are also coming as well, and so everybody is just seemingly coming for this reunion, to the point to where Clark is just like, oh my god, like all these people are just here, and all of them are just one just big old death trap after the other to just kind of get around, or just ultimately try to just uh, kind of survive through. So when going into this, Clark is also trying to make the best out of his work. Ultimately, he works for, I believe, some cereal company in this movie, to where ultimately it seems that he is going to be getting a bonus. And so, reasonably, Clark is putting up a lot of from his family because he is just like, yeah, but that bonus though. But that Christmas bonus though is just gonna like make me just go, just feel all warm and fuzzy inside. I don't need Christmas gifts. I don't need anything under the tree. I just need that Christmas bonus, and I will be fine. But then also we also need to stick the landing on traditional Christmas things. Whether things go horribly awry, justifiably, this family is like, no, I want this thing because, of course, we have to have this thing because it's Christmas. And so everything has to be justified by a holiday having to do any number of things within this movie. And so that is the enjoyment that I have with in this movie is the misery that people go through in order to have a traditional look of a holiday when looking at it. It's only one day out of the year. But I don't know. It's just tradition of it all. I guess it's just reasonably just like, hey, uh, like we, because to me, a lot of times I just like when working in like a retail environment, it's like the goal is just to make it through Christmas. So like you're kind of like Christmas for within that goal is just like I don't like Christmas just because it's to just have to get through that holiday. And so when you kind of are outside that bubble, it's just the fact it's like, well, like Christmas is like, yeah, it's cool and all. You get some like cool things like a Macy's Day Parade, or you get stuff like that happening, or you get like you get to go to parties and some holidays and stuff like that. But recently, it's just like, man, like you put a ton of effort for a holiday that's again just one time a year, and then ultimately it's like, okay, well, is back to the wait till New Year's, and then like you gotta do a party and something like, so it's like wait weeks later and just celebrate again. Um, but I can't pretend that Christmas isn't like wasn't always a fun holiday for me. It wasn't always like one of those where like, especially when you're really young, you just can't sleep for the entire night. You're just like, oh my god, I can't wait for Christmas. I can't wait to just like usually for younger people, it's like, oh, I can't wait for Christmas break, and then ultimately, like you'll have the fun of that of just like, oh man, Christmas break, this is gonna be sweet, and So you have like seemingly like 2 weeks off or like a week and a half or something like that. And like, man, was that always just like, oh, I can't wait for Christmas break. And then also you couldn't wait, uh, like you couldn't sleep on Christmas Eve going into Christmas Day. And a lot of times I ended up like, once I got older, I was like, I would just start sleeping like really late on, on Christmas days and stuff like that. It was just like, I'll get to it eventually. I'll get to Christmas Day. It'll happen. It'll still be there. Um, it'll still be a day. But anyways, so I guess let's just get into spoilers about this movie. Let's go ahead and just talk about Christmas Vacation. So let's go out of our way to dust out that double five to otherwise say happy holidays to everybody, but reasonably at the end of the day, or Merry Christmas, honestly, to me. Because honestly, I would not say freaking I would not say happy holidays. I would say Merry Christmas, and I hope no one's offended by that. But ultimately, if you're watching a Christmas movie review, then this and that, whatever, what have you. So let's go into spoilers right now. Spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time to have fun and enjoy the seasonal time of Christmas. So, in the very beginning of this movie, we have it to where the Griswolds are ultimately making their way to go for a tree. Ultimately, to be singing Christmas carols, or ultimately just to be singing seemingly anything, because normally in the very beginning of every single one of these movies, you have them drive along singing something. And really, we have either Ellen or Clark that is ultimately saying, like, oh yeah, like that sounded really great, or whatever. They have to like compliment themselves for the singing that they did. So funny enough, we have within this movie where really we have seemingly this like back and forth with this bizarrish truck and the Griswold's vehicle of sorts. And so really we have this like truck that is kind of wanting to get ahead of them, and then ultimately Clark wants to get uh, ahead of them, and then so ultimately it's just like swooping and swapping and stuff like that. People like throwing on brakes. It's getting to the point where Helen is just like, dude, like I don't want to be dead on Christmas. So like let them just pass, or ultimately just kind of like just try to find a way around them. We ultimately have it to where there's this back and forth, like people like ultimately continuing to just get in front of these vehicles, or trying very much consistently to get in front of one another because they just aren't going fast enough with seemingly no much traffic here. So eventually, funny enough, we have it to where Clark mentions to his kids, "Hey, hey, kids, is that a deer?" Ultimately, their kids are looking, and the wife is looking, and Clark gives these guys with his truck the finger, and ultimately. I thought that was freaking hilarious. I'm like, oh yeah, that's part of this movie. Because I remember at some point, like I posted an image of Christmas Vacation where Clark, of course, is giving like the finger, and ultimately, I think the meme was it's like, yeah, this is what I feel about Christmas or something like that. It was a joke, because ultimately, it's like. Or like that's what I think about the day after, or that's what I feel like I want to do to Christmas Day, uh, after it's over or something like that, giving it the finger or whatever as it's passing by. Because ultimately, like especially for, yeah, like I said, like the retail mentality of it is like, oh yeah, just that is over. Now we just have to kind of get through any number of just returns that are happening, or people that ultimately especially like there's a lot of people that just tend to use stuff just for the holiday and then just return it the very next day, and it's like, wow, that kind of seems convenient for all of a sudden like something to not all of a sudden work the day after a holiday. especially if it's not a gift. Because ultimately you just see a lot of small appliances and stuff like that would get returned right around Thanksgiving, and it's like, yeah, you just used this for the holiday and then you just returned it. It wasn't the fact that it was broken. No, it was perfectly fine. It was just you wanted to return it because ultimately you're like, yeah, I used it and now I'm gonna just return it now. This could be a renting fee for ultimately anybody. But anyways, so we have at some point where Clark is ultimately just wanting to pass these truckers, but he ends up underneath seemingly some semi that has some seemingly wooden like or a bunch of like tree trunks kind of tied to his semi, and so reasonably Avatar Clark is just kind of like, I can't get out of this, and ultimately he swerves out in the right way and ultimately gets out of it, and eventually ends up being able to park after smashing into this fence. He ultimately ends up parking in the right space to eventually just get a tree from out of the forest somewhere. The entire time Autry is whining and crying about how cold she is. Reasonably, I'm sorry, Audrey. I have no sympathy for you. Zero sympathy. Like ultimately, by the time that they were to get the tree, supposedly Audrey's eyes were blind and this and that because she can't see because she's so frozen. I'm like, dude, you were outside for like what, a whole like 20-30 minutes? Come on, really? I've been outside in cold for numerous hours, ultimately to do things, and so reasonably, I have no sympathy for Autry, who is frozen solid after I'm assuming not being outside in the cold often enough. Sorry, I have no sympathy for a person who's gonna quickly and easily just freeze. So ultimately, it was just coming as just like, God, I just don't want to hear this from Audrey, to be brutally honest. So we have it to where Clark ultimately gets the tree, this big, huge, gigantic tree. And so now Clark ultimately is coming home with this thing, schlacking it all the way. And so now we have it to where Clark is chopping or chainsawing this, I think, the roots of this tree. And ultimately, I don't know why, like, you would. Like, if you're going to cut down a tree, the worst time to actually do it is probably in the winter. Because really, there is a lot of times just anywhere there's a lot of ice, and reasonably it just kind of gets down to like putting a tree especially in the middle of winter is the worst thing to do just because it's the hardest thing to try to get anything in the wintertime, let alone a tree that has roots and stuff like that. uh, Reasonably you would have had to have chainsawed the bark of the tree to ultimately knock this thing down. But anyways, so because reasonably you wouldn't try to dig it out. It's really very extremely hard because the ground is like concrete when it's wintertime. But anyway, so mood point. We have Clark who is chainsawing off the roots of his Christmas tree, and so his neighbors, who are reasonably, ooh, Margot and Todd. Uh, Ultimately, I know recently Julia Louis Dreyfus, of course, ultimately playing Seinfeld and numerous other kind of things. Nicholas Guest is ultimately Todd. But anyways, so they they end up saying like, "Hey, where are you gonna put that? Where are you gonna put that tree, Clark?" And ultimately, Clark rebuttals with like, well, I'm going to stick it to where the sun doesn't shine. Like, how about you come over here and I'll show you where I'm going to put it? And ultimately, Todd is like, hey, that's kind of a harsh thing to say. It's like, hey, I wasn't, and Clark was like, hey, I wasn't talking to you. He was talking to his wife. Because, yeah, it's big old F you. I loved that. That was awesome. Man, to have that joke be said again to anybody, freaking, just a masterful, just like, freaking that little joke is just comedy gold. But anyways, so we eventually push this tree into the home, which is an arduous looking process when eventually it gets in there. And then eventually we have to have Clark eventually cut this tree, and then ultimately have him consistently saying us like, tree's full, a lot of sap. Man, if we probably did Christmas Vacation again, I would probably have to say that if ultimately Chevy Chase didn't want to do another one of these, I would probably have to say it would have to probably be probably Ryan Reynolds. I think Ryan Reynolds has done a Christmas movie before called Just Friends. So I think in the end, I think Ryan Reynolds would probably be a perfect, uh, maybe not Clark Griswold, but because ultimately they would probably just maybe go with a completely different family, maybe be calling it differently. Because I think maybe just kind of just showcasing it's like, hey, we're gonna kind of do this again, but it's not gonna be the Griswolds. It's gonna be like another family altogether. Um, but I think Ryan Reynolds would be great to do any number of these situations and scenarios and whatever. But anyways, so we have it to where this tree is freaking huge, and so reasonably this is what they use to, of course, seemingly put in their house. But I think everybody's just like, God, that tree's too big, it's not going to fit in the house. Like I think Rusty was even mentioning that the tree wasn't even going to fit in their front yard, let alone in their house. So the tree goes up, and ultimately, we eventually have to push now to ultimately have us be told that things are going well with Clark's business. It seems like he is really getting pretty good within this cereal company. He's talking a lot of cereal jargon that makes no sense to me, and ultimately, it seems that Clark is quasi being a brown noser, but not to everyone. It's just the only one that really matters that ultimately is going to give him his Christmas bonus. While also telling every single one of his other bosses to kiss his ass or kiss that ass or kiss someone's ass or whatever. And and when it comes down to certain rungs of certain people. So pushing on to have Ellen tell Clark that not only were is his parents coming, but her parents are coming too. Ultimately, Clark has this like magazine where ultimately he like has to like fling the paper, and it like more and more stuff just continues to get stuck to his hand, to where even his wife's own hair gets stuck to his hand. His lamp gets stuck to his hand, and like that's a funny little scene because always I guess those magazine papers were really sticky back then. I guess so. Pushing on to have ultimately the Griswolds going shopping, quite possibly trying to figure out their last minute gifts. We ultimately have Clark who goes and sees a woman who is bizarrely just selling lingerie at a counter that makes no sense to sell lingerie on. Like, she obviously has like jewelry counters that are around her, and but she has lingerie that is, I would assume, displayed in cases, which makes no sense. Anybody who would have actually worked in retail would ultimately tell you this makes no sense to have a lingerie panties thing being sold this way. But I guess this movie is just like, well, no, like, if anything, we just needed the visual of this girl, like, being behind this counter, and reasonably, we just needed the visual of Chevy Chase, like, hovering over this counter, looking at this girl so closely, making jokes about, like, that he was, that he was browsing. There's a bit of a nip in the air. He is utterly baffled and or lost for words, and he is just utterly just muttering just obscenities that ultimately could offend this woman, but ultimately she is not quite quick enough to grasp any of these words that are coming out of this man's mouth. At some point, just talking about uh, these look to be the breast, I mean the best that I've ever seen. No. But like jokes like that is like consistently like kind of popping out of Clark's mind or mouth at this point. So reasonably, we have seemingly Clark and then eventually Rusty making his way to the lingerie portion of this store, which ultimately, again, there's no way that they would sell this lingerie like this. It doesn't make sense. But reasonably, we have also this woman behind the counter ultimately going ahead and also displaying for every single person to see, which I believe her name is Mary. Yeah, I believe her name is Mary. Ultimately displaying exactly how her panty line is, which ultimately I'm just like, okay, again, this would not be something you would probably do in a store. You would probably do something much more private. But recently, I guess this woman was like, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna make a sale today. Believe me, like this guy is gonna like is just already just so befuddled about my looks that ultimately I can sell him anything. I can sell I can sell him snow in the middle of winter right now. So I'll just kind of use my wilds or whatever to quite possibly maybe get a sale out of this. Which ultimately I don't see a lot of women do often, but there are also some times where you kind of also hear about stuff where ultimately there's some times where women tend to wear like lower cut tops and stuff like that. I've heard those kinds of things and those kind of like tricks, I guess, at some points in some jobs, because ultimately you kind of hear things like little hisps of like, hey, yeah, this girl came in here with a low cut top today, and yada yada. You kind of hear that kind of talk, like talking of just like, well, I bet she's gonna get a good sale today or this and that, and so like you kind of hear those things, but ultimately I just otherwise just kind of like, well, I was never in a kind of selling capacity. I was always just kind of in the back room, just kind of doing whatever I did for whatever job I needed to do. So ultimately, that's I don't know. All this stuff is probably gonna end up like God. He's just talking about it's what happens when you work in those kinds of jobs for a while. You just hear things and know stuff. So reasonably, we have Rusty eventually going and trying to reel back in his father, but is also kind of enjoying the show as well. And Rusty's just like, "Well, hey, Dad, hey, yeah, we're gonna continue shopping." And Clark is just like, "Oh yeah, hey, Rusty, yeah." So pushing on. So I'm going to start just kind of getting to the points of just portions of this movie where it all just kind of like eventually at some point will all trigger into any part of this movie at some point. It'll probably not be all melted together or whatever. So you, of course, have to have a moment where reasonably you have the, of course, in-laws come in, or the grandpas and the grandmothers and stuff like that, and reasonably they have to talk about their ailments, they have to talk about uh, their issues, their feet problems, their uh, bowel problems, and so on and so forth. And so reasonably everybody has to hear about that. And ultimately we also have to like hear also the kind of Griswolds at some point even saying like, oh my god, like if we have both of these families at some point, they're just going to be like consistently talking about some kind of food or some kind of thing that like one person left to the other house or something like that. And it's all going to be just like repetitively just like some kind of food like story or food like thing. But anyways, so pushing on to have Rusty maybe having to massage one of his grandmother's feet for a whole quarter. He's like, a whole quarter? Oh, no. So pushing on to eventually where Clark has to, of course, uh, desperately wanting to do more traditional Christmas stuff besides the Christmas tree. Ultimately, he wants to light up his entire home. Seemingly, no point of which that his home cannot be lit at this point. So ultimately, we have Rusty with this big, huge ball of twine of Christmas lights where he has to unravel, and Rusty is just looking in like utter misery of just like, it's like, God, like, you just wrapped this whole thing, and oh my God. So we have Clark who tries to otherwise start putting up some portions of these lights, and he is of course stapling them to his home. He of course has to stupidly try and staple all these, and he ends up stapling a part of his shirt, which ultimately, if his ladder seemingly isn't all that stable, then ultimately he is going to seemingly uh, really, while ripping off his shirt, I'm like, good God, this guy is going to fall and hurt himself. And his neighbors are rooting for that to happen. They're like, oh, could he please just fall and just hurt himself? For the love of God, could he just please hurt himself? And so we have it to where we eventually have more and more of these lights being put on. And so reasonably, while Clark is eventually doing that, it gets to the point where we rush to have almost the finished product of this home, where it seems like lights are covering this entire house. This entire house. Ultimately, this kind of reminds me of the Danny DeVito movie Deck the Halls, where ultimately Danny DeVito's character wants to have his house being seen from space. So ultimately, when Matthew Broderick is ultimately finally seeing the finished product of Danny DeVito's house, ultimately it is so bright for him that ultimately there's like no like reasonable thing that could get to dampen that light or whatever. So ultimately he has to like call his neighbor and just say, hey, like, how would you not have that on like all the time? But anyways, so we have Clark who ultimately is trying to get this thing work. Drum roll, please, to try to get this whole house to light up, and of course it won't. Repetitively, people are saying it's like, well, make sure you check every single bulb, because if one bulb won't light up, every single thing else will not light up. We ultimately have it to where Clark is ultimately mentioning to Rusty, it's like, hey, we checked everything, didn't we? Like, I checked everything, I think. And so, reasonably, it gets to the point to where Clark is like, well, maybe I have to go and recheck everything again. And Rusty's like, yeah, oh, gee golly, you know what? Like, look at the time. Like, I have several like I have homework to do. I have on Christmas break. I have homework to do. I have bills to pay, and some other like I have to brush my teeth. I have to take a shower. I have to. He was making up all these like excuses of all the stuff that he had to do, which made absolutely no sense. So reasonably, we have it to where Clark is repetitively trying to figure out like what things were to light up. Maybe he's flipping toggles and this and that. Eventually, he tries to, of course, plug this thing back in together repetitiously, and then eventually, at some point, somebody just hits a light switch that ultimately turns all of these things on. And then his neighbors are like, "Oh my god, this is so bright!" And they're ultimately like falling all over their home because they ultimately are in a very ill lit room, and ultimately this home is so bright that is ultimately making them like fall down the stairs and hurt themselves, and it's freaking hilarious. So sadly enough, they're getting hurt for comedic purposes. But anyways, so we have this house consistently lit, and then ultimately someone turns off a light switch, the light switch again, and then ultimately all of these lights are gone. Clark was trying to beg everybody to come out there to a now home that is now not lit. But ultimately, somebody turns on the switch again and then lights the house, and then ultimately Clark is like, "Yeah!" As we also see the electricity in this house just spiraling up. So while this is going on, we eventually see yet another family member that is making their way to come to this home, and that is, of course, we have Eddie. Eddie Johnson and Catherine Johnson, who ultimately has their kids with them, as well as this dog called Snot. So now we have that going on, and so reasonably we have to where Clark is ultimately dreading having Eddie come to his home because Eddie is a very much more hillbilly ish like style of person that ultimately is not all that intelligent seemingly, and so ultimately Clark is just like, oh my god, is this guy gonna accidentally just light my house on fire just because like he is trying to figure out how to make a oven work or something. I don't know. Uh, like what he's gonna do to mangle or mess something up. Uh, but we ultimately find out that eventually within this movie that it seems that the Johnson family doesn't seem to have much for money to even afford anything for Christmas, really. So ultimately, Clark is going to have to begrudgingly just go, "Hey, like Eddie, like, do you have anything for your kids for Christmas?" And ultimately, like, try to help them out because ultimately you have the one of the kids ultimately mentioning that ultimately they got the Shaft for Christmas one year when even they were really nice. So moving on, we have ultimately Clark that still cannot believe that Eddie is here, and he's like, "Oh my god, I didn't want these people to come here." But we find out that Eddie and his family are in an RV, and ultimately they had just gotten here from fumes. Ultimately, by shopping the next day, we hear about all this, and ultimately we just kind of hear more about like Eddie not being able to afford Christmas, blah 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 blah. So pushing us on to eventually having even more relatives come to this home at some point after Clark ends up going through a sledding adventure that ends up taking a very long time to go through. We also have to find out that Eddie has a not a metal plate but a plastic plate into his head, and he has to break down like how basically if he doesn't have enough like padding onto his head or ultimately he doesn't have enough this or that. Like ultimately, if one part of his brain just gets knocked slightly, like his hair will never look right again, and has to go through all of this like metal plate stuff talking about his head and hair and everything like that. I'm like, good God, like I don't remember any of this part because when looking at it, I'm like, God, like this, like the just the either winging of some of this stuff or reasonably the actual lines that are going into here. I'm like, good God, there's some times where like Eddie is just going off for like a while, and you don't know if all of this is just like him improvising or him like reasonably like going on script. Either way, this was just like this was either like really funny and or really like hilarious stuff going on here. Which if it was all not improvised, like huzzah for the writing for this movie, because ultimately there's just a lot of stuff where people are just gonna be like, oh my god, God, these relatives or God, these people are just what a piece of work every single one of them are. And so reasonably we head on to there being more relatives being coming into this family. Uh, we ultimately have Lewis and Bethany. I'm going to completely skip over the time of which where Clark goes up to the attic and tries to get some of the Christmas gifts in there, and then he ends up getting stuck in there to just watch some video. I think that part of this movie is just kind of like it's kind of nice to, I guess, reflect on like Clark's past, but I don't think that that scene is relevant to really go over and talk about. So I'll just negate that whole scene. So, but I at least I threw it out there and mentioned it, but I just don't think it's relevant enough. So pushing on to Lewis and Bethany, who ultimately we have Lewis who is like, "Get my stogie," and like he's this very dark, gravelly like voice, which I every single line that he talks and mentions, I'm like, oh, this is so much like I like this actor, and of course every single time like he says something in this movie, it's always it's for the most part a very like memorable thing throughout this. But we also have Bethany that ultimately is a character that is a person that doesn't either seem to quite hear what people are saying or reasonably doesn't really quite understand what people are saying. Or at some points, like when Bethany does hear like some of the stuff that Lewis does say, I just kind of find it funny. When ultimately he talks to Bethany, it's like, you couldn't hear a dump truck going through a nice nitroglycerin plant. So we have it to where within this movie that we have Bethany and Lewis come in, and we ultimately find that Bethany ends up wrapping her presents very creatively, meaning she reuses stuff that is already in her own home to make presents to other people. Like she is gift wrapping her cat to supposedly someone else, and she's also gift wrapping some food to someone else to, I guess, eat. I guess at some point. I guess not really realizing that ultimately she had also made other food that has cat food in it, and so while they go on to now they all eat dinner. We have some very creative meal choices and a very quasi uh, torn apart like bird. When Clark easily tries to slice into it, it just confetti's out, and I'm like, okay, so like what does that turkey mean? Like did they cook it for too long? Like I don't quite understand the whole point of the turkey, like just completely just confettiing like that. Was it just like ultimately we have it to where Catherine was ultimately crying, And Eddie's like, "Why are you crying?" It's like, I know we put it in too early, and like ultimately Clark's trying to save it. And he's like, "Oh, hey, look, there's a heart here. There's a heart." So recently, we get the funny montage of everyone trying to eat this dinner, and they're all like, everybody's just like, everybody is like, it kind of sounds like they're all eating nails. Is like that's what it kind of like either eating nails or eating pennies or change or something. They're all like, everything is like it's basically like they're eating on bones. Is pretty much like honestly to me what all this sounds like. And then we eventually have Snot go and like so recently we find that Snot has evidently been choking on a bone, but ultimately we find out that Eddie wasn't giving him the bone. It ultimately we find Snot eventually just digging through all the trash, and we find the trash everywhere, which is like, oh great, that is like the worst thing to do. Have to re-rifle through your trash to put it back into the trash bag or trash can. And then too, when it also comes to Christmas, I think for me, whenever I would get like a ton of like gifts for like Christmas, I would just be like, oh my god. Like for me, I would always like come in with like a trash bag like already just like set to go because I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna rifle through all this like gift wrapping, and then I'm gonna throw it into a already preset up trash bag because I always thought that that was the smartest thing that I could do, especially when I would get just a bunch of gifts. I would always like, yeah, I'm gonna first off get my trash bag, so I can throw all this wrapping paper in there, um, because I thought that that was like the smartest thing to do. Whenever I'd have like a Christmas where I'm like, God, I'm like I'm just gonna get like so much wrapping paper all over the place. Why not just easily put it in a trash bag? Uh, to already just have that eventually be like, oh, okay, well the trash bag paper or the wrapping paper is full of this trash bag, so I can just throw it away easily and just get another trash bag and just like eventually unwrap presents that way. And then also when anybody else had wrapping paper, like, hey, just throw it in this bag. And that was the always easiest way to just kind of get through Christmas every single year. Instead of having to clean up afterwards, I could clean up while I was like unwrapping stuff, which is always like, yeah, like one less thing to do. One less thing to do. So, anyways, so when going into this, yeah, we have it to where ultimately Lewis is, of course, asking for his stogie because evidently Clark is not really doing anything constructive, and Clark is just like, "Oh my God, I'm just gonna murder Lewis. It's gonna happen. It's gonna happen tonight." So recently, we have it to where Lewis eventually gets his stogie and ends up burning up the entire Christmas tree. To ultimately, we have it to where now Lewis is almost caught on fire, but also the Christmas tree is basically donezo. And so recently Clark is just like, you burnt down my Christmas tree. And Lewis is just like, oh, well, ah, it was a little big anyway. It was a little full anyway. So we eventually have this Christmas tree completely ruined, and recently now, like Clark is just trying to save Christmas by getting any Christmas tree that looks like a Christmas tree through any of the homes that are around, ultimately crashing through his neighbor's window with a new tree. And funny enough, we have it to where his neighbors ultimately were thinking about Todd and Margot. Ultimately, we're thinking about, hey, how about we actually get a tree? Like, we don't have to decorate it. We don't have to do much anything. Let's just get a tree. And let's just have a tree here. And Todd is like, well, well, where do you think that we can get a tree at a time like this? And that's when the tree comes crashing down, and you have Clark just taking his neighbor's freaking tree and using it as his own, and he's kind of reusing some of the lights or reusing some of the like ornaments that were from his old tree. This one, and just trying to save whatever he can. So here's where we eventually just get it to the top of the upper echelon of interesting things going on. So within this new interesting looking tree, we ultimately have a interesting looking thing within it. Ultimately, I had seen a news video of a woman who ultimately had a raccoon stuck in her tree because ultimately she had evidently left the doggy door open, and a raccoon ended up sneaking into her home to ultimately sneak into her Christmas tree. To ultimately, she luckily I guess had a dog, but yeah, so she had to kind of sneak around her house to ultimately try to get this raccoon out of her home. And I'm just like, okay, like that is the goofiest story that I've ever seen. And that kind of reminded me of the scene that comes along next. So ultimately, Clark is looking through his tree because ultimately we have Bethany that ultimately is mentioning, hey, yeah, I hear something. Do you hear something? And that's when, of course, Lewis hits her with a, you wouldn't hear a dump truck if it was going through a nitroglycerin plant. And so ultimately, but Bethany can hear a little squeaking, a little screeching. And so Clark goes to check it out, and surefiably he finds a squirrel in his Christmas tree. So we have certain people passing out, and we ultimately have the rest of the family all run out of the living room, with the exclusion of Lewis and Bethany, because nothing besides death would really scare them. So we get it to where Clark is mentioning, "Hey, where is Eddie? Normally he eats these things." And reasonably, Catherine is just mentioning, like, "Oh no, he wouldn't eat it. Like, it's not good for him." So we have it to where Clark is making this weird, bizarre, way of trying to trap this thing by shoving it into his coat and smacking it with a hammer, which makes no sense. But anyways, so we have it to where Clark and his father both go out there. Clark Senior both go out there to investigate to try to find the squirrel. And funny enough, they can't find the squirrel. Maybe they think that it's gone, but it ends up onto Clark's back, and that's when Clark Senior ends up yelling "Squirrel!" And then everybody like just starts running all around the house. Clark with the squirrel on his back is running through the house, and immediately they're eventually seeing that Clark is having the squirrel on his back, and then they're running all over the place, and eventually it gets to the point where also the where Snot is eventually seeing the squirrel running throughout all the house, knocking all kinds of stuff down, fine china, everything possible, a bunch of dishes, everything, and to where eventually Margot is, of course, Clark's neighbor and is not putting up with this crap anymore. And so, reasonably, she is just wanting to settle the score of their neighbor, and Todd is not wanting to do anything. So Margot goes all the way over there to confront Clark just to get a squirrel in the face, and then the dog to push her over in her trouble for her trouble. Ultimately, when she comes back to Todd, she ultimately punches Todd because she is all in shambles, and he's like asking, "What happened to you?" So the squirrel is now gone, and so recently this is where we get towards the very tippity top of the controversy of this home. So we now have to get Clark his Christmas bonus, wasn't which was not a bonus at all. Basically, it was just like, hey, yeah, here's a Jolly of the Month Club or Jelly of the Month Club or whatever the heck that is. I have no clue what that even is. I guess that's just a stupid little coupon thing that makes no sense. So reasonably, Clark is just like, oh my god, what a piece of garbage. Because ultimately, he was waiting to ultimately have already put the ground floor down for money to pay for his pool, which he already fantasized about when the little girl came in and told him that ultimately they were getting the shaft for not having Christmas stuff. Ultimately, Clark was fantasizing about all the people that he was going to have over for the pool, even nightmarishly looking at uh, Eddie in a speedo, but then eventually fantasizing about the merry girl that he had saw in the shop. Ultimately, she was wearing seemingly a bikini, but then eventually that fantasy eventually went away when the girl came in. So we ultimately have Clark's money and or budget just completely dashed to where he is desperately demanding that he wants one last Christmas gift, which is his boss. And ultimately, he kind of goes into this huge rant about his boss, how he's a hopeless, heartless piece of that he is. Hallelujah. Where's the Tylenol? Going on to this whole like rant about about his boss and how a piece of crap that his boss is, and so on and so forth. So really it just gets to the point to where like Clark is desperately grasping for eggnog or whatever that will just like get him just to like calm down somehow. And we eventually have it to where Clark Senior is going to Clark Junior, and it's just kind of like, you know what, like how about we all just leave? Like if anything, like this holiday is turning out to be worse and worse and worse as it goes along. There are some people that already were wanting to leave, but Clark was like, no, we're gonna stay here, we're gonna stay here as long as it has to take to just stay here. Ultimately, Clark is just chainsawing off his his stair post or his post of sorts, because ultimately it's like consistently like ricketing back and forth, so he just chops it off. Evidently, everything can be solved for Clark with a chainsaw. So we have it to where people wanting to leave. Clark is desperately asking him to stay because he wants to pull off the perfect Christmas. But really, Clark Senior is just telling him, it's like, dude, like this is not gonna work. Like if anything, like Clark mentions how their Christmases when he was with his mom and dad weren't the greatest either, and ultimately he's asking his father, "How did you get through it?" And ultimately, you have a word Clark Senior is just mentioning like, "Well, I had a little help from Jack Daniels." And we're like, "Yeah, go ahead, yeah, just drink it up, because yeah, I can understand the hardships of probably holidays at some point." So we ultimately have it to where pushing on past this point that reasonably, yeah, we have it to where seemingly Clark is going to mutter uh the of course Christmas classic book that everybody always reads during Christmas time, and ultimately he asks his father if he's going to do it, and Clark Senior says, "No, I'm retiring. You do it." So, ultimately, the night before Christmas. So Clark starts muttering the words of "night before Christmas," but then ultimately he sees out of a window that Eddie had gone and gotten Clark's Christmas present, which was his boss with a big old giant bow on his chest. And so, reasonably, we have it to where we have Eddie coming in with Clark's boss, and ultimately Clark is ultimately mentioning, it's like, hey, like if anything, I'll take the rap for whatever Eddie did, because recently Eddie was dumb to just kind of take my words and do something with it. Like reasonably, if you're gonna blame anybody, blame me. And but if anything, like I just felt so angry about all the uh, people that you shafted from Christmas bonuses, and this and that, and like it's like, well, hey, like I didn't give Christmas like Clark's boss is like, hey, I didn't give Christmas bonuses this year, and he's like, well, yeah, of course you didn't because you shafted everybody. So eventually, we have seemingly Clark's boss calling the police. Eventually, the SWAT comes in, bashes through this home, and ultimately, we have it to where Clark's boss is ultimately just saying, "Hey, hey, whoa, whoa, whoa! Like you crashed through his entire home, but and ultimately have everybody like put their hands up. But I'm not going to press any charges. If anything, I realize what a big mistake I did by freezing all the Christmas bonuses, and so ultimately, like Clark's boss is ultimately mentioning that, hey, like any bonus that you were gonna get, like you'll get 20% more. Like, yeah, everybody's excited, everybody's high fiving, and everybody's having a good old fashioned like, hey, yeah, we're feeling good now, and so everybody goes out of the home to ultimately have it to where Lewis ultimately ends up having to light his stogie one more time and throwing his match to ultimately explode the sewer main, because ultimately when Eddie goes into, of course, that great line of the shitter is full, and ultimately uh, he's spewing all of his toxic waste into a storm drain that isn't the best to do, ultimately leading to when some sorry person is going to light a match to explode that thing, how it's really going to go off, to where ultimately we just kind of see a Santa and his reindeer just rocketing off into the night, and ultimately we have Bethany, who is uh, murmuring I believe the American national anthem towards the very end of it, and everybody else is chiming along, and then Bethany at the very end of it says "Play ball," and I'm like, okay, and so everybody is kind of happy about this. You have ultimately Clark and Ellen that are having like one last moment out in here. I think everyone else is just kind of either celebrating or whatever. And so, reasonably, we have Ellen and Clark, and they're just hugging out. And ultimately, Ellen's like, yeah, like, good on you, Sparky. And eventually, she leaves. Ultimately, Clark is like, I did it, and that's how the movie just ends. So, yeah. Always a really good classic movie, and ultimately, there's so many iconic lines going on in this film. But I think more than likely, everybody will probably more than likely remember out of anything "Shitter is full," and that's about it. A lot of people might remember some random lines coming out of this. If anybody could remember the entire line of all the stuff that Clark says to his boss, holy crap! Because there's a lot of rambling and stambling and whatever through that line. But yeah, I love this movie because it always is funny. Every single line always lands, no matter how many times you see it. Because I think every single time you see it once a year, or you just kind of see it a couple times through December at some point, probably. But anyways, I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.